Well, hello, good morning and welcome. Welcome to our latest Bristol Life Business Surgery, this time with VWV, new thinking for all businesses in tough times. Hello to you all, and I hope this finds you well as we continue to address the challenges as we attempt to navigate our way through these unfamiliar terrains, each day an interesting and new challenge. My name is Greg Ingham, and yes, this is our Bristol Life Business Surgery. What we're trying to do with these is to help businesses with practical advice and valuable insights. We can all do with help, whichever size, whichever sector, whichever type of business we are. These Bristol Life Business Surgeries should help you with actionable insights. We're trying to get practical help for businesses from great experts in their field, and of course for free, which is always useful. They'll subsequently be available on our Bristol Life YouTube channel. We'll come on to today's discussion shortly of dispute resolution, contracts, funding routes, responsibilities for directors, and helpful new thinking. Also hearing perhaps a few case studies about what's actually happening out there live now, with due confidentiality, of course. This advice is for business owners, senior managers from all sectors. Whatever changes were wrought by the pandemic, the basic principle of businesses' operations remain fundamentally the same. The eternal verities apply. Control costs, drive revenues, look after your teams, look after your clients. The thing is, when faced with material doubt, the obvious thing for many of us to do, at least initially, is to do nothing. When you don't know, you often don't do. Well, that's fine up to a point, just not fine in these times where we all have to adapt weekly to new circumstances. Hoping it will somehow all improve is not unconditionally recommended as a strategy during the pandemic. Whatever the macro position and the evolving governmental response, we're all having to just get on with it, finding new ways of developing our businesses, whether more of what we do or radical pivots to new models. Truth is, if we all just don't get active and get promoting what we do, there's even less certainty about business this Christmas and next year. The absence of action means that inertia fulfills its own prophecy, and that simply cutting costs, while essential, can only take you so far. We all know as business owners what has gone has self-evidently gone, and we all just need to refill our pipelines, all need to run harder to try to make up what has gone. So yes, in short, hope is not a strategy. Time to play catch up, time to give it a proper go, and that's what we've been doing with Bristol Life, pushing our businesses, just like yours, to make up for the most in these times, recover what we can. A couple of parish notices before we start. Bristol Life trading. Bristol Life, our magazine, is fully back and in pretty good health. We're actually tracking a little ahead of what we had forecasted. And I do not say that hubristically, more because Bristol Life is a reasonable barometer of business activity across all the sectors in Bristol. It's uneven, of course. Not all areas are performing as well as some. But it was ever thus. Bristol Life is a mini portfolio business in its own right. Thank you for your support, all your support. We're mutually dependent. Your support means that we can champion your business, your areas, and play our part to the full in supporting businesses in our city and celebrating the greatness of Bristol. Our regular monthly Bristol Life Business Clubs will remain virtual for the time being. Next up is the uber topical one of the nighttime economy on Monday, October 26th at 11 a.m. They will return in real life to the Avon Gorge Hotel. Much is definite. The actual month, less so, for obvious reasons. One thing which will continue virtually are these Bristol Life Business Surgeries, deep dives into key areas. If you have a professional service, please come forward and we can help promote your activity. Anyone looking for new business, it's a great way of showcasing your offering. Quick update on the Bristol Property Awards. The really good news is, despite all the difficulties, the travail of the lockdown over the summer and the pandemic and so on, we've had a record number of nominations and finalists, which is pretty pleasing. Great to receive those, great to see the stories of success of how people are driving their businesses in these times. We've been discussing a bold new vision for 2021 with all our sponsors and will unveil the full plan next week. Please look out for that. It relates to the point very much about getting active and not just hoping for the outside world to change. I'd like to thank all of our sponsors, very much led from the front by Smith & Williamson. And then, bit of a roster, here we go. AWW, Blaze Commercial Finance, Clark Bond, Close Brothers, Cotswold Homes, Halsall Construction, Juniper Homes, Marsh Commercial, Optima Systems, Origin Workplace, Workspace, Original Style, Planning Portal, Rate Setter, Royds Whitby King, Shawbrook Bank, Spaces, Thornbaker, Triangle Networks, Vickery Holman, Wilmot Dixon, and YTL Developments. Companies coming together to celebrate the excellence of their sector. Right, to business. So we'll be hearing from three partners at VWV, David Emanuel, Ed Rimmell, and Ed Husband. Perhaps if you would like to come forward and join us in this event, I'll just tell our audience a little bit more about you. David is VWV's chairman, corporate banking lawyer. That's his experience, London-based. David advises on transactions, M&As, employee ownership trusts, disposals, funding, and so on. Key areas include independent schools and family-owned SMEs. Also coordinates VWV's international offering to overseas clients. Ed Rimmell specialises in commercial contracts and projects, from long-term supply and service contracts to contractual JVs and so on. Wide range of clients by size and sector, particular specialism in renewable energy. Ed Husband leads VWV's litigation and recoveries team based in Bristol, commercial disputes, insolvency, restructuring, debt recovery, and has nearly 20 years experience in resolving commercial disputes. Good morning to you each. I hope this finds you reasonably well in these odd circumstances. Let's first talk about VWV as a business, as an organisation. How have you been operating in this strange new world? So tell us about the nature of your business, this trading business this year.
Okay, shall I deal with that?
Please do, yes.
So in Bristol, Bristol is our head office. A lot of you will know the name of Bristol. We've been business in Bristol for 200 years or so. And in the last decade, we've actually expanded out into other locations, so London, Birmingham, and Watford. But our core business is still based in Bristol, and we have around 220 staff based in our still relatively new office in Narrowkey House. It feels relatively new. We've been there for about 4 years now. And on the 24th of or the 23rd of March, when we were all instructed by Boris to go and work at home, the firm was able to do that straight away. So from the Tuesday morning, I think it was, everyone was at home working. And I'm sure it was the case for many others of you. There's that kind of initial scramble as to how everything works. The sort of technically less able, like myself, sort of have learned sort of hugely in the last few months of how to use things that previously I would just reach over and ask a right young thing to help with. And so that's worked very successfully. We had from the start just a very small team based in the office, mainly around the sort of function around processing paper, because obviously we still generate a lot of paper and post, although again it's amazing how much has sort of gone online. And again, many of you have been maybe been signing documents in the last few months. You have been using things like DocuSign, which you probably weren't using before, but there's still core team.
David, there's an example where this great pause has also been a great accelerator. It's allowed your business organisation to move forward in a direction you were travelling, but faster probably.
Absolutely. I mean, I think with all these things, they were all sort of coming forward, but probably it would have been another 3, 4, 5 years before people like banks, for instance, would have been comfortable with signing documents in those ways. So we've had that core team. And then beyond that, people up until sort of the summer, people were just coming in a little bit, usually if they needed to get something in the office. But largely we encourage people to work from home. We were actually planning to go back in September, and our plans within a couple of days of being announced to staff, and then again the direction to work at home again came back, so we've sort of put that on hold. We were hoping to do that for a variety of reasons, but I think mainly I think we found that by and large we've been able to work efficiently at home. But I think a lot of people, I think we all miss that sort of social sort of interaction, and then for some people clearly.
So if I could ask you and our other two panelists, how have you attempted the functional side of business for all of us? Many of us can work from home in a pretty, at least, adequate way, but the cultural or the softer or the relationship side is more difficult. How have you sought to address that point?
So I think most of us are certainly in sort of leadership positions spend a lot of the day now on calls with people, and we try and do a mixture of sort of work calls and social calls. Just occasionally, I've actually gone out to meet people for a drink in a sort of socially distanced, compliant way. But by and large, we've kind of you've had to spend a lot more time on sort of internal communication than you might have done previously, where even though you might not have been speaking directly to people very much during the course of the day, just by being in the same room and the same environment together, somehow that sort of communication or sense of togetherness sort of is there. So it requires a lot more work, I think.
Sorry, and what about clients? I mean, other than the obvious that you're spending a lot of time on Zoom, I'm sure, with your client. Other than that, has these times changed the way in which you interact with your clients in any way beyond the technical?
Only, I think, in that we've all accepted that at the moment we by and large meet remotely, and I think actually, things, when you get invited, say, to attend board meetings or those sorts of more formal meetings, again, in the past you'd have got in your car and driven to some clients' business premises and done it that way. Whereas now I think everybody's used to that, and actually it creates more fluidity and more ability actually to sort of meet at short notice. So I think there's a lot of value in that, in terms of being able to do things quickly and attend. For instance, I'm going to a board meeting in a couple of weeks on out in the Mendips, virtually, and if it had been a question of having to get in the car and drive and go there, I may not have I may have gone, or I may not have been asked to go, because obviously there's the cost around attend that. So I think there's been a lot of positives around that, but so far the ability to meet clients in person in the way that we always used to enjoy is still quite limited.
Let's come on to clients and the nature of business in Bristol currently. I mean, clearly it's going to depend on which sector, but can you just pick up between you some key points about characterizing your client's view of their business life currently? What's the feeling out there? Is it on balance more hope than fear, gritty determination versus acceptance? What are you experiencing?
What are the Ed's like to,
Slowly with that, I mean, the nature of my work, Greg, I deal with a lot of other professional practices, so lots of accountants. So again, I think they're a really helpful barometer, because obviously they have their own clients in the local business community. I think from them, probably cautious optimism remains probably the kind of watchword. A bit like us, they've adapted to, the challenges that COVID has brought. I think professionally they see opportunities to advise lots of their clients, to assist them. But again, they're having to adapt in the same ways that we are. But I think everyone needs to be flexible. So all of our clients are almost adapting on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. So that seems to be the nature of it, because obviously we see different government announcements, everything else. Things need to be extremely fluid.
The human spirit is unstilled by these extraordinary times, I guess. Perhaps other than perhaps the obvious ones, tell us about any sectors which you found to be in better shape than others.
Well, some aspects of the tech sector have done very well out of this. I mean, none of us had heard of Zoom in February. I can imagine, or most of us hadn't. And certainly on the corporate side, in terms of transactional work, that's an area which has held up quite nicely, really, and people have been scrambling for to buy the businesses that kind of work in this environment. Plus, obviously, the strong areas around things like cybersecurity data, big data and so on. So some areas have seen, I think, a great deal of positivity. I think for the rest of us, for those people on this call who are in, leisure and retail and events and so on, that terribly tough times.
Yeah.
But I think for a lot of businesses, we're surprised, given where we thought we were in March, as to it's been okay, not brilliant, but okay, and we're still here.
Mm. I think there's something sort of deep in the DNA of business owners and senior leaders that we're finding ways to get on with it, and it's not the world we wish, but we've got to figure it out as best we can. However, at the margin, there are of course disputes, and maybe there's more disputes occurring now than hitherto. And so perhaps Ed H, talk us through about dispute resolution process. I mean, from the outside, it appears to be it's essentially commercial problem solving. Is that an adequate way to describe it?
Yes, I think that is a good way of describing it, Greg. I mean, I think a good litigation lawyer is a problem solver, but he or she is adaptable to the situation. I mean, there's circumstances in which you need to be aggressive and robust for your clients, but equally there are ways when you need to find a way through. I think what we've seen, certainly over the last 6 months, is a greater accommodation between businesses. So although the disputes are certainly out there, and goodness knows businesses have faced a number of challenges over the last 6 months, I think the reality is there's probably a greater commercial and corporate understanding of what people in your supply chain, for example, are encountering.
I mean, it seems from the outside to the process that litigation is ultimately a failure of reaching that consensual point. Are you seeing more or less litigation, going that far than previously?
Probably less over the last 6 months, I would say. I mean, the disputes are out there, so we're actively involved in trying to resolve those disputes. I think what we're seeing less of is formal action being taken. So if we talk about formal action as issuing court proceedings, we're certainly seeing less of that. And given the challenges that we face with things such as, court proceedings, actually court hearings taking place, we're seeing them being a lot slower. So the reality is where things are taking longer, so that probably puts the onus back on, the participants in the dispute and their lawyers to find a way through. Because if you're going to the court to resolve it, you're going to be waiting longer than you were previously.
So to put it a different way around, these times are actually it's yet more foregrounding a particular expertise in finding resolution which isn't based on litigation. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think we've seen within the kind of within the sector in which I operate, greater technology. So court hearings can be by way of they can be by way of Zoom or other means. Equally, we're seeing lots of mediations that are taking place remotely now. So a form of dispute resolution where you have an independent third party trying to resolve the dispute, those are taking place much as we're talking now. So I've got one in about 3 weeks' time with 10 participants will all be on this kind of this kind of setup. So we are all adapting to having to do these things.
However, the longer this goes on, and none of us have any clear timeline about how long, but it's a rolling at least 3 months, probably 6 months, maybe longer in some form. However it goes on, isn't it inevitable that people are going to be becoming more disputatious, if only because, frankly, they'll be more desperate?
Yes, and that's typically from the kind of from the usual business cycle we see. Recessions certainly bring more disputes, and it's a way, if a corporate transaction goes wrong or if a contract fails, then certainly parties will be looking at recovering their losses through that process. So I think we certainly will see more formal litigation coming out of the back of this. So again, I think we're in a slight hiatus now, and that goes for kind of corporate insolvency as well. We're seeing, despite all of the challenges out there, the current insolvency figures are showing that kind of formal insolvencies are about 25 to 30% down on this time last year. So we're in a slightly odd kind of hiatus at the moment.
We'll come on to insolvency, because I know there are some technical aspects which may help explain that point. But I just want to, I'm not clearly not trying to make it anything worse than it is in reality. But is it fair to characterise that we're moving, in perhaps in general, from a more supportive period into a more critical phase, and therefore we all need to be a bit tougher? Because if that's happening, then the tide rises for us all in trying to resolve our issues.
Yeah, I think that's almost certainly right. So, I mean, let's characterise it. For the first 3 or 4 months, businesses were working out how they would cope, adapt to the kind of current situation. I think now that we all recognise that we're in it for the longer haul, then the reality is that businesses need to plan, and litigation is a necessary part of that planning. If they have a dispute that they were perhaps shelving, now is perhaps the time to start thinking about how you need to address that. If the problem isn't going away, then you need to work out how you're going to resolve that, whether it's by, alternative dispute resolution or by formal litigation. So I'm sure you're right that is the case.
Is it sort of pragmatic and sensible to be for all businesses on this to be reviewing their contracts and sort of dusting them down from whichever shelves or cupboards or virtual filing cabinets they have, because this will become more of a focus for business? Or is it, stick to your knitting, get on with your business, don't worry about that, don't think about problems until they occur?
No, I think it's important to be proactive. So, I mean, leaving things on the shelf and not enforcing your contractual rights, certainly that's not something we would recommend. I think it's important to, to take a proactive approach, and also think about, if you have got a dispute that can't be resolved, how are you going to fund that? That's another challenge, and a very practical one. So, certainly there's an increased opportunity out there to obtain litigation funding. If you've got a significant dispute that you're worried about how you might finance that, increasingly there are options. So there are funders and, a large number of law firms are willing to act on that kind of basis going forward. So I think certainly if you don't move your dispute along, other than the technical aspects of limitation and losing your contractual rights, disputes become more difficult the longer you leave them, and you have less chance of resolving them. So if you have got a dispute, it's better to grip it now and try and resolve it earlier rather than later.
It's generally good commercial advice. It's probably good personal advice as well. If you've got a problem, take it early. I guess is what you're saying. Yeah.
I think it might be worth.
So go on.
Sorry, it might be worth just flagging that, quite apart from what to do when you think there's a dispute brewing, it is worth dusting down the contracts that you've got for those relationships where there isn't currently a dispute brewing, because a lot of them will contain monitoring type provisions and mechanisms that allow you to sort of manage that relationship before you get to the stage of there being a dispute. And if you're not using those provisions and sort of actively engaging them, then you're not taking the benefit of what you might already have tucked away on the top shelf. So I think you're right, Greg, dusting down your contracts and having a look and seeing what rights you've already got is definitely the right approach, because that might avoid getting into a situation of disputing litigation.
And just on that, Ed R, that is, could you perhaps give an example of where there are provisions in existing contracts that are helpful in these times?
So if you supply goods, you supply products to a third party, and they pay you on whatever 30-day payment terms, you might have a mechanism in your contract that provides that you retain title to those goods until they've been paid for. And alongside that mechanism, there'll often be some machinery that imposes obligations on the third party as to how it looks after those goods in the interim period. And the reason for that machinery is to protect you. So if you need to go and get those goods back because they haven't been paid for, you know that they're there to get back. And that will come with audit type rights. So you can go and check, and you can check that they're looking after those goods and doing the right things with them. If you're not implementing those audit rights, you might find that by the time you come to rely on that clause, it's too late and the goods are gone, or they haven't been looked after in the way that you were hoping they would. So that's the kind of thing for those kind of important contracts and those important relationships. Just check what you've got and have a think about whether there's something you can be proactively doing to try to head off those issues later.
And I think that's very sort of salutary advice for us all, that pretty much everyone is living in some sort of eternal present at the moment, and when it's difficult to raise your horizons and think further ahead. But we absolutely all need to be doing that precisely to protect our medium-term positions, let alone long-term positions. I'm going to ask Ed, it's probably more for H. It's a personal question really, that when it comes to resolving disputes, I mean, of course, you're representing your client and therefore have a duty to act in his or her best interests. But can you nonetheless still be an honest broker? How do you manage to sort of navigate that, where you've got a material dispute between companies and you are repping one side but seeking to get agreement between them?
Yes, it's a good question, Greg. I mean, I suppose I always think of it as a litigation lawyer wearing two hats. So one is acting as an advocate for your client and putting their best case forward and getting to the best position that they can be. But clearly, the other hat that you wear is one as an advisor. So, if they have a good claim or a not so good claim, then you need to tell them very clearly what the risks are and what's involved. I mean, in terms of acting as an honest broker, I think, clearly we have a kind of a responsibility to get our clients to the best position where they have to be. But quite often that can be a mutual position. So I touched on mediation earlier. That's often an extremely effective tool to get into that middle ground. So, I mean, I think very often we think of the kind of deal that you want to get to is one that both sides are slightly unhappy about. That's that's probably the reality. If you think you've got to that point and both parties think they've probably got slightly less than they're entitled to, that's probably the right kind of middle ground that you're looking for. But again, mediators are extremely skilled at doing that. So, that's something that I would strongly advocate. Yeah.
Now is not the time to go nuclear, if only because going nuclear is going to take bloody ages because litigation is drawn out further. Yeah.
It is, and I think the other point is if you push too hard, you can push your counterpart to a point where one they're not willing to reach a resolution, or you push them too hard they can't actually meet. Let's say you get a judgment, they might not be able to pay it, particularly in the current climate. So you need a commercial perspective as well as a legal perspective on these things.
Let's come on to an obvious area of both contracts and disputes that's absolutely focal at the moment, which is property. That many businesses, you briefly talked at the beginning about, your fantastic, lovely new offices, about 4 years old or so, that, your teams are not there. I'm not talking about your business specifically, but as a sort of metaphor for others. Many commercial premises are not being occupied. So naturally, for some tenants, they will be pushing back with their landlords about their own obligations. Can you just talk about that, whether you've seen an increase in those sort of disputes between tenants and landlords over leases and provisions?
I'm going to largely avoid that question, Greg, because I'm not a property lawyer myself. We've got a specialist property litigation team. I mean, the current situation, as I understand it, is certainly in terms of landlords, they're prevented from taking forfeiture action against tenants at the moment until the end of the year. So that's a kind of a government measure in response entirely to COVID. So I think the reality is, I've used the word hiatus a couple of times. I think certainly from a property perspective, we're in that as well at the moment, because even if there are property disputes, landlords can't take direct action except in extremely limited circumstances against their tenants at the moment. So, these are, again, a part of a kind of a bundle of government measures to try and, kind of keep the ring at the moment. So, because otherwise, there's such a risk of, widespread failure and chaos out there that that's one of the measures in place. So I wouldn't necessarily be qualified to comment on the number of disputes, but certainly, again, I think those disputes are there, but they're not being pursued yet. So again, perhaps in the early part of 2021, we might see a significant increase in those kind of disputes when those measures are lifted.
With the caveat that you've clearly mentioned that you're not a property specialist, I just want to understand and make sure that others have got this point. So that period of abeyance runs from both personal as well as commercial properties, but only until the end of December currently. Is that
Yeah,
the position?
That's right. And I mean, they are being kept under review. So again, that's something that has been extended. So, and there are a range of other measures which were recently extended in the last 2 or 3 weeks until the end of the year. So again, that's an example of the government reacting to the kind of pressure out there.
Would you, with any number of caveats you might wish to field, would you expect that to be extended, given its importance to commercial businesses at both ends, both tenant and landlord point of view?
Yes, I think my personal view is that it would perhaps be extended, perhaps for another 3 months until March, obviously depending on how the kind of economic climate fares out there. David, I think you were going to
Yeah,
comment.
I'm not. Yeah, I agree, Ed. I mean, and I think what I was going to say was that I think anecdotally, and I think a lot of, and it'd be interesting to hear what people on the call, what their own experience has been, but I think a lot of landlords actually have realised that they're not going anywhere, or they're not going to be able to go anywhere in terms of their conventional routes with this. And
Yes.
a lot of landlords have been offering either rent holidays or moving to monthly, rent in arrears type situations. So I think a lot of, there's been a lot of common sense, I think, on both sides to try and just keep things going. And obviously, it's very helpful that that their usual sort of weaponry has been taken away from them. But I think in most cases, there's been a sort of, well, we are in this together, and we need to sort it out in a sensible way.
I mean, what we have seen in the retail sector, of course, is lots of retail chains seeking to renegotiate with their landlords as well, even pre-COVID, but certainly worsened by that. So there's been a widespread use of company voluntary arrangements to try and avoid those kind of liabilities and to renegotiate with landlords. So I think there is a huge amount of pressure on institutional landlords out there.
Yeah, we've had a question from Alex Steele, director of GRIT, which I think is a group of health clubs. You've given the caveat about property, but he wishes to ask this point. What are commercial tenants' rights given the government restrictions and associated impact on revenue and ability to pay rent? I would imagine he's talking specifically about the health area because they can't trade, they therefore can't use the premises. Much the same applies to hospitality as well. How does that work? You can't trade, you can't use the premises, but you've got an obligation.
So just to understand the question, Greg, so obviously if there's a situation where in that scenario the health club can't trade, so what particular issue is the question?
Well, I would imagine, and I don't want to make it too specific. David's own sector. Alex's own sector. It's more that if government says that you can't do X, and you've still got your liabilities, your costs, and so on. What rights do tenants have to seek to mitigate that with landlords, or are there none?
Well, at the moment, I think there are none. As far as in a legal context, obviously, you'd need to understand what the contract said. I mean, I suppose we look at it from the other point of view, in that at the moment, the landlord can't do anything to enforce those rights. So I think it's probably just a matter of commercial negotiation. I mean, certainly, I know from a personal perspective, we've had kind of tenants coming to us looking for payment holidays and other things. And I think generally, landlords might be accommodating, particularly if they've got a good covenant there and they've got potentially a good long-term tenant. One would have thought that most landlords would be accommodating to that if they recognise the future viability of the business, because clearly having someone who will be a long-term tenant, it's better to look beyond the current kind of crisis that lots of businesses face and look to the long term. And I think again that's why landlords can't take action certainly until Christmas.
Let's talk about some other aspects of disputes. Which areas have become more prominent in these times than previously? So
in terms of sectors, I suppose, we see a real range. We're seeing lots of kind of supply disputes. That's the kind of the nature of curtailed supply. Seeing quite a lot in the kind of construction sector. We're seeing a huge amount of pressure there. We've touched on a few others: retail, hospitality, particularly. So we've seen a significant number of disputes in that sector. Lots of them related to kind of solvency concerns. So we also act as a practice for lots of charities. You might be surprised to hear there are lots of kind of charity disputes out there at the moment, just because of the funding pressure on charities.
So what sort of pressures might those be on charity? I mean, we understand, of course, there's funding is ever more precarious and need is ever greater. But where are the disputes arising?
So, typically from a kind of a financial pressure point of view, lots of charities are finding pressure from the kind of withdrawal of funding. Lots of them rely on trading subsidiaries for their income. So
they're commercial arms, essentially.
So, for example, without identifying them, we've given advice to kind of galleries in London who have had that kind of pressure through lockdown. So, previously they've had an extremely strong income stream that disappeared virtually overnight. So, those kind of pressures are there, and businesses are, charities are businesses in a sense. After all, they have to adapt in the same way that other organisations have to.
Can coronavirus be deemed force majeure?
You'd be amazed how many webinars we ran on this subject. It's a very fair question, and a lot of people kind of assume that, crikey, this thing's happened that we didn't expect to happen, so of course we should be protected by force majeure. Depends on what your contract says is the really boring answer. And for a lot of contracts, it's kind of within the category of what can constitute force majeure. But the question was more around, or the important question was around, what's been the consequence of that for us? And very often, other than where you have sort of actually prevented from providing a service, it was impossible for you to provide the service. The fact that it had been made more difficult wasn't sufficient to give you the protection you wanted. So yes, there were force majeure provisions out there that were being implemented, but it wasn't the sort of saviour for everybody that people might have expected, because the way a force majeure clause works is it allocates the risk of this unexpected event onto one or other party, and if it's not on you, it's on your counterparty. So it's a question of looking at the contract and seeing where does it place the risk for that unexpected event. There's another concept out there which is similar to force majeure, which doesn't rely on what's in your contract, which is called frustration, and that's a sort of general principle of law that says, broadly says, if the performance of the contract has become impossible because of some extraneous event, then the contract is ripped up essentially. Now that's a very difficult test to meet. There's thinking about your landlord case and your rent case was a interesting case on frustration a few years ago related to Brexit, where a European agency in London wasn't allowed to operate out of London any longer because of Brexit, because they had to be in the EU. That wasn't sufficient frustration to be able to allow them to get out of their rent, so they're out of their lease with the property they were leasing. So it's a very difficult test to meet. So yes, look at the contract if force majeure type circumstances like COVID crop up. It's not necessarily the answer to everything. I think what we're saying now for new contracts is, that this is in the background. There might be a flare up in 6 months' time. Don't rely on a sort of standard force majeure provision. Now is your opportunity to think about what you actually want to happen and where the risk should lie, and govern that now, agree that now, rather than just rely on something which is entirely generic. So we're seeing lots of businesses coming to us and saying, how can we document this? How do we best allocate that risk if there's another lockdown, or if there's something similar that happens next year?
I mentioned at the beginning, this was we were hoping to get actionable insights, and I'm going to boomerang it straight back to our business with Media Clash. Precisely that point about, now that we all know that this thing is out there, and heaven forfend maybe recurrent or continuous or whatever, we all do need to look at our contracts, and we will be looking at our own contracts when it comes to such as our awards and events and so on, because like so many people, we have not been able to do the physical things that we would have done otherwise. So Ed, that's very timely you should say that. So I've gained benefit from this. I hope others have as well.
Those event contracts where we're getting a few a day earlier in the year, with people that have booked events or people that hired out space for events. It was a recurring theme. It was probably the biggest area of that force majeure thinking earlier in lockdown. So you're doing the right thing, Greg, looking at those contracts.
Yeah, and I mean, it also just highlights, I mean, so many businesses, I mean, I'm sure we've been guilty of this, in any time, but certainly in past times, that contracts are heavily negotiated over, they're back and forth, and then left. And it means that when disputes arise, it's the lack of familiarity. You touched on this previously, but how can you help guide clients to anticipate problems? So much of law is about imagining unlikely circumstances, the point at which companies in some way are getting together, you're almost having to plan for the divorce. How do you guide companies to anticipate unimagined outcomes?
I think the really unimagined stuff, so the next pandemic, I think that's very difficult. You can guide in general principles, but in terms of negotiating for the particular pandemic, I think that's really hard. I think what clients can do is think about the stuff that actually is reasonably likely to go wrong, whether it's triggered by something like the scenario we've got at the moment, or just more generally by sort of the natural cycle of businesses. And that, those sorts of things are, you know, non-payment. Are you being paid? What are the early warning signs that things might be going wrong with those payment obligations? Are you seeing your debtors slipping further and further to the right down your list of sort of aged debt? And if you are, what can you do about it? Because there'll be provisions, or there ought to be provisions in your contract that allow you to step in and start pulling some levers to put that right. If you leave it so long that the company that you're dealing with is on the verge of going bust, then it can be very difficult to pull those levers and get the kind of recourse that you need. But if you spot the early warning signs and you do something about it at that early stage, you're going to be in a much stronger position. Similarly, on the other foot, if you're dealing with a supplier who's supplying you critical goods that you're reliant on, have you got systems in place to keep an eye on how that supplier is doing? Are they performing well? Are there warning lights flashing that suggests that perhaps things aren't going so well for them as you'd like? And what can you provide? What can you do under the contract to protect yourself against those risks? So, but the contract, I think the message here is hopefully a lot of the folks on this call will have good contracts that have some robust provisions in them. You use them and sort of dust them down and check what you've got, and use those provisions. That's how you're going to best protect yourself, rather than waiting till you've got to go to bed and say, it's all gone wrong, how do I fix this? Far better to be forewarned and prevent that circumstance from arising.
The other point to make on that, Ed, is that as well as, you know, as we know only too well from the last 6 months, that, you know, things change in terms of, you know, the commercial scenarios, factual scenarios, that the law also changes. So, you know, one of the recent kind of wide-ranging things that's happened as a result of this Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act is that parties can't terminate their contracts for the failure of another counterpart to that contract. So that's a significant change. And going back to what Ed was saying, you know, relying on termination provisions, that tends to be too late now. So having some more proactive steps in your contract, Ed mentioned kind of step-in rights. Equally, if someone's not paying you and they can't pay, you know, having something like a parent company guarantee or other provisions, it's probably not relying on one particular point in your contract. Having a range of options in your contract is, you know, a much more proactive thing, and that's the kind of thing that Ed would look at.
So could you just talk us through the main provisions, or the newer, more impactful provisions of SEGA, and what it means to SMEs particularly, about the ability to you know, wind companies up or seek restitution or whatever? Yeah,
sure, happy to do that. So SEGA was kind of enacted in June this year, so as a response to the crisis, effectively. There's some fairly technical insolvency aspects that I think probably don't have a general application. I'll touch on one of those though, which is probably, in terms of an insolvency process, there's now a moratorium available to companies. So if you're suffering from temporary financial distress, the directors can stay in control of the company and get a temporary moratorium, so to guard themselves against creditor action. So that can be anywhere from an initial period of 20 days up to a year, depending on various kind of provisions. So that's a kind of, I suppose, a short-term response by the government. Although that's a permanent provision, that is a new effective insolvency procedure available to companies out there. So if they have a good business that can survive as a going concern, that's one option available to them.
Is that very broadly, sorry for the sort of layman's terms, is that very broadly similar to Chapter 11 in American provisions?
Yes, yeah, very similar. So we previously had and still have administration, but this is an addition to that. So effectively, it's kind of what we would call a debtor in possession procedure. So it allows the existing management to stay in control of their business. Effectively, it's then just monitored by an insolvency practitioner. So you still need an external professional involved, but much more than traditional insolvency procedures, the management stay in control, but they have that safeguard against action. So that's one new provision under SEGA. I suppose the other one that is probably of broadest application is the ongoing suspension of use of statutory demands in winding up petitions. So again, that was originally extended to the end of September, and it's now been extended again to the end of December this year. So at the moment, unless you have a pre-existing debt, so a pre-COVID debt, it's extremely difficult to rely on a statutory demand or a winding up petition, even if that debt is properly outstanding. So again, that's a temporary provision that's been extended to the end of the year. So when I touched on the formal insolvency figures earlier in this call, Greg, that's one of the significant reasons why that's the case. Yes. So company winding up are significantly down on this time last year. So again, that might be storing up some of these until next year, but at the moment, you can't progress even if you have a valid debt that's owed to you. You can't do that. It's important to say that that's just in a corporate context, not in an individual context.
A couple of points there. Much like the earlier one with the disputes, would you expect that to be rolled forward if it's running to the end of December currently? And I'm sure that's a personal view, whichever you express, because no one actually knows. And the other is, has there been any change to the sort of lower level issues to do with, say, CCJs, where companies are seeking to get actions taken against their debtors who haven't paid?
So in response to the first question, I think probably. I think I could see it being extended for another 3 months. I think a point will come where, normal business has to resume, and, creditors who are owed money, they should be entitled to take proper action. I think in part it's one, to maintain the kind of, the general economic cycle out there and equally, frankly, because the courts probably couldn't cope with the number if free rein was allowed. So I think it might well be extended for another 3 months. In terms of CCJs, no, nothing's really changed there other than the point that I mentioned earlier. It's taking longer. I know kind of, certainly from speaking and dealing with some of our clients, we are a major utility supplier, and throughout COVID, they haven't been taking any kind of real court or enforcement action against their corporate or individual clients. So that's almost been, a corporate decision, I think, probably not to be seen to take advantage of the economic distress out there. So certainly, again, I think that probably goes, for responsible businesses out there, they probably deferred action.
If they've got robust enough balance sheets, it gives them the strength to do that, I guess. Others may not. So I guess the pressure will rise as trading issues for some businesses continue.
Yeah, and I think it probably goes back to my earlier comment as well, that sometimes taking that, let's call it aggressive action, might not be the most productive thing to do. There's no point taking action if someone can't pay. Sometimes it's better to wait, as long as you have an insight into their financial status, because it might be worth supporting them in the medium term.
Let's move on to exit planning, either of volition or forced, which both are apparent. Is it fair to say, are you experiencing this whole great pause, lockdown, hiatus, however described, has prompted people to think in a slightly more existential way about why they do what they do, and even to consider exiting, that it's helped bring forward that thinking that might have been there previously, or is that just pie in the sky?
It probably brings forward the thinking that, people generally want to sell in a good market. And so unless you're in a business that, is thriving at the moment, then you're probably going to, your plan, you'll be thinking about it now. And there's lots you may therefore want to do around preparing for that, in terms of, making sure your business is what we call sale ready. Thinking about your, how it works for you in tax terms and so on. So there's lots of work that you can do around that. But generally, people will want to pick the moments kind of work for them to maximize value if they can. Obviously, there are some distressed sales we'll have to go through at some point. But as Ed said, that doing that through insolvency processes isn't going to happen. So. I think a lot of people are thinking about with life, what's important to them, and so yeah, definitely.
And you mentioned about getting businesses sale ready. In brief, perhaps, what might that entail? And I know I'm sure you'll say it's never too early to start thinking about an exit. But
Yeah.
what is sort of a typical horizon timeline for an SME watching this now?
I think probably. I mean, it depends what it depends as usual, but I think you need to think about, if you sell a business, then the buyer is going to ask you all sorts of questions about the soundness of it, and the quality of your contracts with your customers, and whatever aspect of your business is the value. You need to make sure that that's very well sort of documented and set out, and so that you've got a business that you can sell on to somebody else, because particularly for smaller businesses, very often it's around the individuals or the small group of individuals who run it, and if they leave or move off, then the value dissipates. So it's about making sure you've got those contracts in place, that if you've got sort of informal leases of land or whatever, that you formalize those, so that you've got a sort of robust business that you can pass on to somebody else, where it's demonstrably the value carries on after you've left.
For the most part, isn't this an inherently bad time to be selling, that pretty much everyone's management accounts will have some odd variances from March onwards, and there'll be any amount of explanation about why it was as it was, and any amount of positing about how it's all going to be better in X months' time. But that as a buyer, it's really hard to place value on business trading when none of us know. Would you really be advising clients to consider selling in these times?
As I say, not unless they're in a business that's thriving at the moment. I think if you can keep going, I say it's a good time to start. If this has prompted you to think about selling, this is a good time to start thinking, how am I going to put this all in shape so that I've got something really attractive to sell in 1, 2, 3 years, whenever it comes to it. And part of that obviously is around reviewing your legal contracts. But yeah, you wouldn't sell now unless you had to, I think.
Let's come to that. The distressed assets that people's hands being forced of necessity. How are you assessing the appetite for risk amongst potential buyers as opposed to caution, for all the reasons that we know?
Again, it depends on the market. So as you said, I do quite a lot in the education corporate space, and actually there was a sort of everything sort of ground to a halt in March, but actually now we're seeing quite a lot of we're acting for quite a lot of corporates looking at acquiring additional schools for their groups, and there are opportunities for them with schools that are struggling. So that's just one example of a sector where there's appetite, and there is an awful lot of private equity money looking for something to invest in at the moment. So there's plenty of money out there looking for.
But capital is inherently ingenious in finding routes to value, and at the moment, with interest rates being so low for so long, equity-based deals must be, you would think in structural terms, have potential greater value, and the sort of tsunami of capital that is out there will need to find homes. Yes. Yeah. So on the whole, the term distressed assets is seen in pejorative terms. It's a sort of a desperation act, but I guess it takes two to tango. And if as a business owner you need to sell, it's actually a lifeline having someone who has the appetite for risk in these times. Are you finding clients coming forward and talking about, they have to get out from under, and they want your advice about how best to approach that?
Yes, I mean, as I say, we because those businesses that were unsound before COVID are probably, I think for those that it's the COVID shock, they've probably found the ways and the funding and so on to keep going and to sort of come through that. but definitely it's just for those that have already been struggling, it's the last 9 months has sort of accelerated that. So that there are options out there, and as I say, that the market, the investor market is coming back looking for those opportunities. So depends on what what sector you're in, what you do, but definitely there are people out there looking for opportunities, and we can sort of help steer clients towards the sort of the investors that we kind of know and see, and it's part of what we often do actually, is we act as a sort of broker to sort of put clients in the way of deals, and we don't even charge fees for doing that. So it's
oh, that's so good of you. I mean,
yeah. So we hope to get the legal work out of it, but absolutely, we're very used to trying to help clients to find solutions.
And we're coming to the end of this, but I'd like to talk about two or three areas to go. One on financing. Other than the usual fiduciary duties of directors, given all the, loans and different structures and grants and so on that there are now out there, could you give some tips for directors and business owners about their financial responsibilities now, which are different from previously?
Shall I pick that up?
Do you want to, yes, I mean, in terms of directors, yeah.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, in a sense, directors' fundamental duties haven't changed as a result of the crisis. I think they've brought them into sharper relief. So, I mean, the usual duties apply. The directors' duties are to their shareholders. However, if the company's in financial difficulty or of doubtful solvency, the directors' duties are to its creditors. So they need to probably focus their attention on all of the good things that businesses have to focus on. Cash flow, more importantly than ever, cash is extremely important. Maintaining good financial records and having up-to-date management accounts, those are all absolutely critical things, because given my role, what I often look at is directors' conduct after business failure. And that's why it's absolutely critical that in times of economic stress, directors are kind of vigilant and act with absolute clarity of thought and document that kind of thought process. So if they're taking decisions in relation to the business, whether that's carrying on trading through a difficult financial period, they need to explain the reasons why they're doing that. So if they're paying certain creditors over others, there might be legitimate reasons for doing that. If you have a critical supplier to your business, you might have to choose to pay them in priority to another creditor. Well, that's the kind of thing that you need to document your decision making. But I suppose the fundamental point comes back to, directors' duties haven't changed, but all directors of businesses of whatever size probably need to appreciate that their conduct might be scrutinised at a later date. So they need to think of it in that context.
Yeah. So it always, as a director, you have fundamental responsibilities. It's a serious role, but if anything, it's yet more serious in current times. And if in doubt, seek advice.
Indeed, and the reality is that directors can face personal liability. So, if that doesn't focus directors' minds, then nothing should.
Yeah.
And keep good records of your decision making as well.
I'm sorry, can you say again?
Yeah, and keep good records of your decision making as well. Yeah. So now is probably the time, if you haven't done it before, to have formal minutes of meetings and things like that.
Yeah. Okay, a couple last questions. One is in these times, perhaps if you could give us examples of new thinking, fresh thinking, either perhaps from your team, from VWV, or from clients about your new ways of navigating this terrain. Anything innovative that struck your mind? Right.
We've all had to adapt, haven't we, to online systems and working more remotely, and particularly businesses where the service provision has had to move from a very much a sort of physical in-place delivery model to a bit like with your event, Greg, I suppose, from an in-place model to a remote model. They've done that out of necessity over the last 6 months. We are seeing businesses start to think, actually, we were quite good at that, and that worked quite well for us. And does that therefore expose us potentially to a greater audience for our services? So yeah, we're seeing a sort of a change in thought process, I think, from it being an entirely defensive, we have to do this in order to survive, to for the right kind of business, and it's not certainly for all businesses, for the right kind of business, they are seeing opportunities to expand their markets a little, and perhaps make up from some of the shortfalls they've been suffering as a result of the last 6 months. So that's been kind of positive. It's been a positive bit for us. And there's not much of it, but it's nice to see businesses sort of showing that kind of flexibility and exploring new opportunities where they can.
Yeah, there's great ingenuity out there, and it strikes us that the entrepreneurial nature of Bristol in particular means that there are some very clever things happening, some which are beneath the surface, others people are forced to do, but nonetheless all are finding ways of trading in these times. One last, a completely general point to you. Are there any top tips for business owners that we haven't covered this morning?
I would say keep your business plan constantly under review and updated. And something else I'd say is for some of you, don't forget Brexit.
I was going to say the very same thing, David. We're still seeing businesses with contracts who trade with the rest of the EU, whose contracts don't provide just the basics around who's responsible for what around shipping, insurance and tariffs and so on. So it's been swept from the agenda for the last 6 months, hasn't it? In a way which probably, if we look back, I think was quite unhelpful. So yeah, it's not long off, and there are things that you can do to put yourself in a good position, or as best you can now.
Well, we've got, in theory, at least 10 weeks to go before Brexit finally is enacted, where whatever form of deal, or indeed no deal, will emerge. And we've got God knows how many months and quarters of pandemic impact. But I'd hope that our business owners, senior business people and so on watching this today have had value from our speakers. And our thanks to VWV today, to David, to Ed and to Ed. Thank you for your time and questions and how you've responded to this. Please everyone look out for our next Bristol Life Business Club, the nighttime economy, as I say, very, very pertinent at the moment. And God knows what strictures are maybe in place by then, but we're running that on October 26th at 11 AM. Remember that Bristol Property Awards announcement next week. There's quite a significant change to the way we're going to be operating. We think we've got a very bold and innovative plan, I hope. Anyway, we're done. This has been a Media Clash production, and this has been our latest Bristol Life Business Surgery, this time with VWV. Thank you. Bristol together.